Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Analyze Scripts. Today we are covering the newly released tragic Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV on HBO Max. If you have not seen it, please watch it. It's 5 episodes that covered basically all of the shows in my childhood and really was disturbing.
Yes.
I don't know about you.
Oh, I had such a hard time getting through this. I noticed I would like watch it and look away. Like it's hard for me to actually stay present while watching it because it was so heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It reminds me of some other things we've covered recently, specifically the program, which we released last month. Really sort of left me with similar feelings of
Yes.
helplessness, anger, rage, grief, sadness, worry, just sort of like all complicated feelings.
Right.
But yeah,
How
especially
could this
because like,
happen?
so I grew, right. And so I grew up in Orlando, Florida, where Nickelodeon like was. It looks like a lot of these shows were filmed actually in LA, which makes sense. But there also were, I remember growing up as a kid, like a lot of auditions, and Nickelodeon would come to our schools to like look for kids. And
Whoa.
they used to do, yeah, like all the time in Orlando. Um, they used to do like kids cleanup day for Earth Day, I think, or maybe they had their own cleanup day. And one time they filmed it at our school, and like that was super cool. We were all like picking up, trash and stuff. But I just remember it was like probably so normal for all kids to want to be on Nickelodeon, but maybe especially growing up in Orlando to feel like it was like even more possible in some
Yeah, you were like
way.
right there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where I was like, if they just have to come to Publix and they'll discover me, like right, like I just got to be in the right place at the right time,
I know. And now
and
I'm like, "Ooh, I'm glad I wasn't
thank God,
discovered or put on these
I
TV
know,
shows." I don't
right, but
know.
like all that, I always wanted to be on all that. It
All
looks
that
like
was
so much
so
fun,
cool. Like, it was
so
the
cool,
coolest. And,
so
oh my
cool.
gosh, I still say things today, like, I still joke around with certain people being like, the Drake Bell and Amanda Bynes skit where they were like, in suspenders and kind of like holding things and I'm gonna hit you in the head with a fish, bang.
Yes,
Like it's
yes,
just that's like core childhood memories that were like unlocked and then traumatized by
I
watching this
know.
show.
Yes, and the Amanda Bynes character with the dark hair, Penelope Taint, like, I remember loving her, and now I
Ooh.
was like, "Ew, that is gross." Like, why would they name her that?
I was
But
talking about
all of
that
this, yeah,
and it's like someone was like, "No, it can't be that." I think it wasn't like Tay, and I was like, "No, it was Taint." Like it
right, but they
was.
did I think they spelled it
With a Y,
Taynt,
yeah.
but still, it's gross, and but, like, all of that went over my head.
Mhm.
Until now, now that they're, like, showing it, and I feel like I had seen some stuff on like, Instagram maybe or the internet or something, like, several months ago about all those, Ariana Grande scenes. I wasn't watching Nick or Disney at that time. I think that was,
Yeah.
like, after our
Mhm.
time, but they're gross. Like, her being squirted with all the stuff, like, I just oh.
I know, and I watching it some of the things I was like, "Okay, that's so weird." And then some of them I was like, you could see why it's like it is some of it, and
Toes the
I'm not
line.
good at like it does toe the line where it's like it's funny kid stuff. Like kids think this is funny, and then there's I think they like knew that and then would like play on it where it's like we can get away with this because like this is funny material. But I just think
Mhm.
too like when some of the child actors were talking about like feeling uncomfortable in roles or like scared, um, I
Yes.
I don't know. Like I think that's where it does cross the line where like this is icky because typically they're all like a tiny bit older, right? Like I don't know, 1 or 2 years from what they're portraying.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I don't know. I was confused about some of the stuff. Some of the stuff I was like, this is so black and white, so disgusting. And then other parts were
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I guess
And
I
I
could
think
see it
that's the
either way.
point. I feel like that's the point because if it's too clear, then everyone will say no. But
Right.
if it's in that gray zone where it's like pushing the envelope, then it leaves, the person at the top able to say like, ew, like, what are you doing putting that like sick twist on these like kid jokes? Like the
Right.
problems with you. I mean, it's a great example of like institutional gaslighting, I guess you could call
Mhm.
it.
Yes, yes, and I think
So,
the thing about kids
yeah.
with just, like, power, right? So, we know that anyone who's in charge of, like, a business, a corporation, even, like, a therapist-patient role, like, there's always someone who, like, has more power, and kids
Mhm.
just, like, by proxy, like, don't, right? Like, they're children, and I
They're
think
just
just thinking
mhm.
about their development and what they really want, I feel like, to me, it feels almost impossible to have, like, safety on sets, like, mentally, right? So it's like you
Mhm.
really want this
Mhm.
thing, you're given the thing that every kid wants, and then you have to keep it, and that pressure, I just think is so impossible
Oh,
to, like, do even in the best of environments. I don't know. I think
right.
it was just hard for me to think about, like, how kids can be okay in places like this when everyone
Ever.
is appropriate, right? Like, when everyone, like, wants the
Yeah.
best for them, or when people are they're going to school and they're following the rules. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't see it. But
Honestly, I feel like this might be, and I'm going to be careful to say this. I might retract this statement later when I have more time to think about it. But this might be the only case where I feel like maybe it's not a bad idea to use AI in the media. Maybe we could use AI for like children roles and just leave real kids out of it. I don't know, like,
I don't think that
because I
that's a hot
agree.
take. I think that that's like
I don't.
I don't know. Like, I think it's so hard to do well. Like, ultimately, these you're making money.
They're
Like,
working,
everyone is making money, right? Like, parents in some cases and not good ones are making money. Like, the kid is making money. The network is making money. The CEOs, the producers, the
right?
writers, everyone's like feeding off acting. So, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess before we go into it further, Portia, let's just lay the groundwork a little bit. We have a
Mhm.
lot to talk about with this episode. So we did decide to break it into a two-parter. So part one, we're going to be talking about today, obviously. We're going to try to focus mostly on the environment on these sets. We're going to talk a lot about what they said about Dan Schneider and about some of the other very brave people who came forward with their stories, like the female
Yep.
writers, Giovanni, Brian, Katrina, Alexa. We're really going to spend time digging into all those stories. And then on Thursday, we're going to devote that episode to Drake Bell's story, his relationship with his parents, and use that to really talk about how perfectly this documentary laid out the steps of grooming. And we'll also link to, in our show notes of that episode and probably this one, just some resources to sort of outline grooming, because this stuff happens and it often happens in plain sight, and it's devastating, and it's because it
Right.
is a slow and systematic breakdown of boundaries. You know, we saw that with our cult episode about those two different cults back in January. We saw that in May, December. Like, this stuff happens in different contexts, and we both thought that this documentary series just perfectly sort of walked you through the grooming process. So we'll talk about all that on Thursday.
Yeah. So I think today, just focusing on like more of the general power dynamics that exist in places like this, I think it was really interesting to me
Mhm.
hearing about also different adult perspectives on the show. So the two
Yes.
female writers and just like the terrible environment that they were kind of exposed to. Again, like writing kids
The
TV, which like
misogyny.
should
Yeah.
be to
How they had
me
to
like
split a
done silly.
salary, like,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, first of all, they had to split a salary, like, ew. Um, it just like right from the start, it's just again that they are at a lower power than Dan Schneider, the director, and also the other male writers. The male writers didn't have to split
Right.
salaries.
Right. And
So
I
even like
don't
when you're
know
in a mhm.
like how that they could have gotten away with that. Like I will also say like this was the 90s, okay? Like things are I believe a little bit different now, but like there were still laws, employment laws and harassment laws and stuff like that. So it's like how did no one else above Dan Schneider and the little like nest egg that was this specific productions like know that this was happening? Like someone cutting the checks, the HR department. It's just like I
Mhm.
it was a lot of people seemed like had inappropriate power, I guess. And it's like, well, these shows are doing really well. Like, we're not going to touch anything. We don't want to get involved. I don't know. I was like, I was having a hard time believing that.
Yeah.
How could they get away with that? But I think I'm just naive. So,
Well, I think also, like, in corporations and stuff, though, like, whoever the most powerful person is, like, they get what they want. Even if it's against the rules, like, they're all dependent on Dan Schneider's approval and desire to keep their
Right.
job. So, like, what are you gonna do?
Exactly.
They might
I
not even know. Like, if he tells you, like, "Oh, this is fine," if you're cutting the checks, you might not like, what are you gonna do? Look in the HR manual? Like, was there an HR manual? Like, I don't know.
I know.
They probably
I
just, like,
know.
trust what the people tell them, you know?
Right. Right. No,
And,
that's
like, the
true.
writers were so thrilled to just, like, have a job on a
Yeah.
big show that they were like, "Sure, I'll work for nothing," you know?
Right, and there's that power, right? So it's like this is a huge
Mhm.
deal, and I think people, know that they have power, know they can get away with things, start pushing the boundaries more and more and more and more and more. It's like I think, a good example of that I would say is like kind of like the massages that were happening on set with
Oh.
with Dan Schneider. It's like you kind of ask once, you read the room, right? Everything was always a joke, like, oh, like, oh, just give me a massage, like, oh, I'm stressed. And then like kind of seeing if people do it, and then oh, people do it and it's fine. So then I push more. Then I, make another, gross joke
Mhm,
and see what
mhm,
I can get away
mhm,
with. Oh, I can get away with that. And it kind of goes on and on and
mhm,
on. Um,
mhm, mhm.
but
And
hmm,
that's again, that's so typical of grooming behaviors, but also
yep,
just any sort of, like, exploitative behavior. Like, where the person in power sort of does something, throws it out there, often using humor to try to disarm you. It knocks you kind of off
right.
your moral center. You're like, "Oh, is this funny or, like, not?" And then they just keep pushing the envelope and they slowly wear down your sense of boundaries and normalcy. You know,
Mhm.
this actually reminded me of something like super disturbing that happened when I was in med school that I go back and forth about like, should I report this? Should I not report this? But we were on our neurology rotation as third year medical students. And for whatever reason, I was with a group of all girls, I think. And we were like in a conference room. There may be five of us. And I think he was the program director, went around the room. I did not, I backed away. I don't, like, again, like, I don't know what about this dynamic told me, like, to say, like, I'm good. I don't want to do this. But he apparently was like a bigwig neurology, migraine guru and went around the room to show people where he would put Botox in the back of the neck to like alleviate migraines. And it just struck me as weird that he was walking around touching all of these young girls' like neck area. And it just always, at the time, I thought it was weird, but I didn't, that was it. But now I've like thought about this now over the years when I see documentaries and stuff like this, just thinking like, that's really weird. And again, that's, I feel like an example of like, you're touching an area, again, like you shouldn't touch your female students ever. But this is one of those gray zones, I think, where it's not like you're fondling their breast, right?
Right.
It's like the neck, and you can try to say, like, oh, I was showing them where I like do the Botox injection. But I don't know. I just think that's weird.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think similar and different. And I think this is which is what this documentary was making everyone kind of feel or remember. Like, this place that I used to volunteer at, there was this one male, like older gentleman on staff, and he would like train everyone who was new. And it was like most of the other
Mhm.
volunteers were females, and it just happened to be most of the newer people were young females. I already had been volunteering there and then got put on this shift, so I like never was trained by him.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
over the time, like all of these new volunteers were like quitting. And it had
Hmm.
come out that he was being like inappropriate with them and like
Mm.
touching, like maybe
Mhm.
grabbing a behind or but like,
Mhm.
all under the guise of like this grandfatherly figure who's like, oh, well, he's a
Yes.
volunteer, right? He's this like good person. And I think that's what
Right.
makes things so like
You
startling
let
and,
your
and
guard down.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and it's like this place should be, fine, I'm safe here, and then it's like, "Oh, I'm safer with this older man who's really, like, n nice and nurturing," and then they do something, and I think most of us, we are caught off guard, and I think
Mhm.
you sometimes you go back, sometimes you might say something, sometimes you might not, but, like, it seems to always happen within these parameters versus, like, I'm thinking, if
Mhm.
bar with a bunch of peers and you kind of are expecting someone to be inappropriate, which again sucks, female experience, but like you're kind of like on guard and ready where it's like if someone, were to kind of grab you, you're like, oh, like what the heck, like get away or whatever.
Yeah, get off
Um,
me. Yeah.
and so I just think these weird environments are always like this happens all the time and it's so
Yeah.
icky or why didn't I say anything or I could have told him to stop and it's like A, we shouldn't have to do that, but B, like I think predators prey on environments like this where they know that
Yeah.
their, victims, so to speak, are going to not be as reactive and not like as suspecting. And that reminded me
Mhm.
just a lot of this show where,
Yeah.
they're it's a kids show, right? Like it's fun, it's silly, like, I mean, and maybe that's not true at all, but like I just think that anything around kids should be like more like protective and safe. And then it's like the opposite comes in
Yeah.
and everyone's like taken aback and unprepared. And it just really made me
Oh,
sad. That
yeah,
A,
for
people have to
sure.
deal with this and B, like it happens so much. I think we could both probably think of more examples that A, we don't want to share or,
Right.
private, but like it's just my heart
Right.
goes out to anyone in any scenario where this happens, and maybe you're asking yourself after, like, "Well, why didn't I do anything? Why didn't I say anything?" And it's like, it's not we shouldn't have
It's
to.
not that easy though,
Right.
especially in situations like this where there's such a big power dynamic. Like on these shows,
Exactly.
they are vulnerable children and these are like the adults. Like this goes beyond like, your favorite coach growing up or your favorite teacher. This is like that amplified, right? And I
Right.
was just thinking about like my experience in medical school that I just shared. Like we were all wanting to get into residency. Some of us wanted to go into neurology, like a lot of us actually in the room. And so like what are you going to do? Like report the program director? Like again, it reminds me actually now of like our Grey's Anatomy episode where like
Mhm.
that power dynamic really makes it hard. And
Yes.
it's so unfair that we all like sort of say like, well, why didn't the victim report it? And it's like because they were victimized. They're like, their trauma bells are going off. Their like trauma response is going off. And part of that often is like freezing. And
Yes.
then like the way it just gets normalized and giggled about and you're looking to the adults around you and they all seem to think this is okay. So that is especially in children skewing their perception of what's okay, right?
Right.
And that's going to make it harder for them to like report anything. And then let alone now you're adding the pressure of being on a major show, financial pressure. I mean, it's not just like the actual kids and the money they're getting and maybe the support they're giving to their personal families, but all the crew,
Mhm.
all the other adults involved are depending on these kids. Like that is just an unreal amount of pressure.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think too, like when it is when something is done under the guise of like, oh, it's funny or I was joking, I think that gives the perpetrator so much more perceived leeway to like walk
Yes.
back or like
Yes.
say one of your co-residents was like, don't touch me, like in a very, assertive voice. It's like, well, now you're being rude because that's now what I didn't mean that. And now you're this rude girl, who's
Right.
like
Yeah.
difficult to work with and can't take a joke.
Right.
And
Right.
I think those two female writers really spoke to,
Oh my
and
God.
finally it seems like lines got crossed for them that they were just like, I have to leave. And then, the unfortunate consequences of then taking a stand or quitting, not getting work,
I know.
being kind of like, put to the side in the whole industry and labeled probably as like difficult, hard to work
Mhm.
with, not a
Mhm.
good team player. And it's like all under the guise of we were all
Mhm.
just fooling around. Like, why can't you take a
I
joke?
know. And you could even see when those two female writers were sharing their stories, like still how uncomfortable they were,
Yes.
that it's still so hard to talk about all these years later. And when the one female writer was, asked about when he asked her to like bend over, remember? And she like
Yes.
really didn't want to talk about it. And that's where I still have this like moral, like morally complicated feelings about, documentaries and stuff like this. Cause on the one hand, I think like we need to talk about this stuff and put it out in the open. On the other hand, like I just worry about everyone involved who's already been victimized and traumatized, and now they're talking about these things, and, like, that scene in particular really made me uncomfortable because I felt like she really didn't wanna talk about it and kinda didn't was, like, surprised it got brought up,
And, like, why wasn't it then
right?
cut out? You know what I mean? It's like when someone so clearly is having a reaction
Yeah,
and doesn't wanna talk about it, it's like, why was it then allowed for someone else to talk about it? And then, like, being like, just showing her vulnerable, appropriate vulnerable reaction to something that was so horrible.
yeah.
I didn't like that. I also didn't like how they kept talking about Amanda Bynes.
Me
I know, like,
either.
that she's a big hot topic. I know that she was on all the shows.
Right,
I know that some of them know her, but, like, I just think that she is continually used by the media as, like, a cautionary tale, as, a way to get more attention on, like, a good cause, but it's still always at her cost, and she is not,
right,
like, a part of these documentaries, so it's like, why are we talking
right.
about her? I don't like
Like,
that at all.
did they get her permission to, like, use her story? I would be
I don't
really
think so.
doubtful. Um, I totally agree. It's like that feels exploitative too. And
Mhm.
again, it's like I totally agree because on the one hand, it is like part of the story, and yet it's her story.
Right.
And we don't know all the details of her story. Shouldn't that be her right to share or not share? I feel like it is making all these sort of suggestions that maybe some of these things happened to her. Like, we don't know, but yeah,
Yeah. And again, like, she's the name on, she's the Amanda Show. She's,
the Amanda
she was
Show.
on all that. So I think, like, of course, we all are thinking about it. We all have our own, thoughts or curiosities about what happened. But I mean, they were portraying it as like is also what happened to Amanda.
Like, Portia, what were you saying? All the other
I,
cast members seem
I think
to.
they kind of, like, protected her, just with, like, it seemed like the documentary was bringing her up, right, in, like, the skits and in the flashbacks, but then, no one was saying, "Oh, yeah, that happened to Amanda too." It was like, so I just think that there's this unspoken thing, with the child actors like Giovanni and Brian at the end, like, the camaraderie, knowing these are the people I
Mhm.
grew up with, like, they're my
I
brothers and
know.
sisters, and they're who I, look back and also have, good memories with too, but it's like a lot of the adults just, like, messed things up as
Yeah,
they
yeah.
do. Mm.
And a lot of the, like, big names weren't involved in the documentary, but footage of them was used a lot, like Amanda Bynes, Ariana Grande, Jeanette
Yep.
McCurdy. That scene near the end where he, like, scared Jeanette, she looked so scared, and now
Yes.
that we know from what she has shared about her relationship with her mom, like, that's a trauma reaction, right? Like, that is hypervigilance,
Right.
and it's just like, don't scare kids. I don't know. I don't know.
I think,
It
and
just
so Dan Schneider had released, like, a, 10-minute interview that he obviously, like, wrote the questions for. Um, and he had said, like, why didn't any of them tell me this? Like, especially the, like, pseudo fear factor episodes that they were talking about. And it's like, well,
yeah,
of course they didn't, because they didn't want to
I
lose their
know.
job. They didn't want you not to like
100%.
them. They didn't want them to get
Right.
hired back. Like, that's why.
You
Duh.
can't you have to know as the adult what is the right thing and what is the wrong thing. You can't put it on them. You
Right.
just can't. Like, it just drives me nuts. It's like another thing in the news right now is, like, Bethany Frankel on her podcast is, like, really going in about all the details of her divorce. I don't know if you're up to speed
Mm-mm.
on that, Portia, because you're not a
No.
Bravoholic like me. Um, but in it, she has a daughter who she shares with her ex-husband, who I think is like 11 or 12. And she starts off this, like, divorce podcast by saying, like, for all you people who are worried about my daughter, just know she gives me full permission. And I'm just like, pump the brakes. You can't rely on your child to give you permission to do something. Like, that's just putting the blame on them, putting the responsibility on them in a way that's totally inappropriate. They're a child. Like, you can't expect that. That's like
Right.
so selfishly, like, relieving yourself of the responsibility to make that decision. It really doesn't sit well with me. And we saw that a lot with Dan Schneider's reactions
Mhm.
here.
Right.
Like, what person wants to be licked by a bunch of dogs with peanut butter all over them. Remember, like, that little boy?
I know. I know. I mean, what person wants to, again, that's not an adult, that's not getting a payout, like, what person wants to sign up to have, like, spiders crawl them or, stuff like that, or have goo sprayed on their face or lick their toe or, I mean, it's just like
Right, and, like, some of that, like, getting slimed. I always wanted to get slimed at Nickelodeon,
yes.
right? Like, getting slimed is, like, one thing, but squirting goo where it looks like a cum shot, sorry to be so graphic, it feels different.
Yeah.
Like Ariana Grande trying to get liquid out of a potato. First of all, it doesn't even make sense. And second of all, it's like so icky to watch.
Right.
Right. Like, but then it's like licking a toe. I think if it happens like once or twice, like maybe it's funny. But like
Yeah.
over and over and over and over, it starts to feel like a fetish, you
Right.
know?
Exactly. And so, we did want to talk a little bit about what we perceived from Dan in the Quiet on Set documentary, which, we don't diagnose people. That's not we do in our private practices, but we do not diagnose
When we're evaluating
people.
them, but not people
Yeah.
we haven't personally
No,
evaluated.
but like, people based on other people's descriptions of him that, Jeanette McCurdy's book, some of the things that they had said
Mhm.
on that, it's a lot of kind of portraying him as this like god, right? Like someone said that he's an
Mhm.
egomaniac,
Mhm.
and kind of two sides of him. So portraying this really like fun,
Mhm.
silly, nice, friendly guy, and then all of a sudden in a split second,
Trustworthy.
like being really, really, their words, abusive, could turn at any moment, they had said,
Mhm.
which just like
Mhm.
highlights to us some like traits that fall kind of on the narcissistic, sociopathy spectrum of things.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you wanted to share a little bit more about what you saw.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, we're not trying to diagnose anyone that's unethical, but I do think in this podcast, we do want to point out these patterns that we're seeing portrayed. Again, we don't know the full story because we've never evaluated these people, but some of these like patterns are what we see with, people with narcissistic traits. And I think in these situations, it goes beyond that into the sociopathic realm because it's like he's using these kids to like almost like act out. It seems like a lot of people in the documentary were suggesting that they were like portraying his like deepest darkest fantasies,
Mm-hmm.
that he would say like, well, all kids think this is funny, but now all of the adults who were kids at the time are like, none of us thought this was funny.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, why are you making them all lick their feet all the time? Why are they squirting stuff on their chest all the time? Right? Like those sorts of things where you're like, were you getting off on seeing kids do this or were you not? The one thing that struck me in this and always strikes me as something I think all parents need to be aware of. If you have a coach, a teacher, a producer, a director, someone working with your kids, and they don't let the parents in for meetings, I think that's a huge red flag. And I think that's something you just have to keep in mind is that parents should be involved. You should not be on the outside. And we saw in this documentary, especially between Brian and his mom, Tracy, kind of what happened when the mom
Yep.
was too involved per like Dan's perspective, that you get cut out. And
Mm-hmm.
that wreaked havoc on their relationship until present day. However, it also probably protected Brian in the long term. Now that we know sort of what happened with Drake Bell and like with other people on the sets. But I just think for me, that's like a big red flag. Like anyone who's trying to weasel their way in and split you off from your parents, that raises huge alarm bells for me
Right.
in my head. Um, and yeah, I mean, the stuff he's accused of doing with the female writers is disgusting. And also, like, just like a power trip, a huge power
Yeah.
trip. It reminded me a lot of like Logan Roy
Yes.
in
Yes.
Succession,
Mm-hmm.
like just like using people as chess pieces and playing them around,
Yep.
rather than seeing them as like fully fledged individual people,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I
like
think
your needs coming above
exactly.
everyone else's.
Right. And we heard a little like snippet about his, earlier life where he really wanted to be an
Mhm.
actor. He got it sounds like he got like typecast for the 90s, which looking back, watching this show, we also are covering Sex in the City. So this is on my mind. But
Oh, I'm sorry, Portia. Now I can. So you were
okay.
saying, can you restart with we're covering Sex in the City, maybe?
Yeah, so we're going to be covering those shows. Again, another like 90s show and just like the amount of fat phobia, fat jokes was rampant on TV. So I think, Dan Schneider had said and others had shared too that he was like typecast as like the fat kid and like, so
Mhm.
you're funny, you're silly, you're goofy, and then like didn't really make it that super far, then got into the producer role. And I don't know if like that those wounds, like,
Mhm. Yeah.
impacted the way that he then really wanted to like have control and to kind of just be
Mm.
at the top. We can obviously speculate about anything, but I just think that it was like an interesting arc where we got to see a little bit of what happened and why maybe he acted the way he did, and I think it's also just interesting that he was around kids, right? So a really vulnerable, easily manipulated population.
100%. Yeah. And it just like begs the question, like, why do we do this to kids?
Yeah,
You know?
I think there's a lot to be done. I mean, the education piece, them getting 2 hours a day or whatever it was required. I think they need to know their rights more. I think it's a really hard
Yeah.
dynamic when you are the earner of your family. Like I think it just
100%.
there's so much there
Flips
that
it.
I
Yeah.
exactly that I don't know
You're
how we can do this
parentified.
right. And I don't know. I
Right.
think that's
That's
where
what I
your thought of
mean. I don't know
AI
how you
comes
can do it
in.
right. Right. Like, I don't know how you can do it right. I don't know. Like, because
Mm,
you are just working. Like, even if it's like fun,
right.
like, yeah, so is baseball. And like sometimes kids don't want to go, and the stakes are way lower to sit out the little league game than to like decide you don't want to go to set that day.
Right.
Right? Like, it's just the stakes are way higher. And I don't think that's an appropriate level of responsibility for a child. It's just,
Mhm.
I don't know in what way could that be good for their development. I just
Right.
don't think they're ready for that.
Yeah. I agree. I don't know what to do. But
I don't
so
either.
that was us kind of talking about all of the child, actors on Quiet on Set. And like we did say, please stay tuned for our episode on Thursday where we will be talking more about grooming. We'll be talking about Drake Bell and just kind of like, some warning signs and just our thoughts on kind of his
Yeah.
story that he shared with us, which was really wonderful. So we hope you enjoy. We
Yeah.
hope you like and subscribe to this episode. As always, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, or you can email us at analyzescriptspodcast or analyzescriptspodcast@gmail.com. And we are excited to hear your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.
Yes. Yes, and one thing before we wrap up, I just want to plug Allison Stoner, who again is another child star. She's
Yes.
doing a lot of work in this arena, and I just am really fond of it. So if you want to hear more or look into that more, please look into Allison Stoner's stuff. It's really interesting, and I like applaud her for wanting to take steps to protect
Mm.
kids.
Yes.
Yeah, so let us know what you thought of our episode. If you liked it, please rate, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you Thursday. Bye.
Bye.